Welcome to OptOut's special COP27 chat. We're going to talk about what came out of it and what to look forward to in the next few months with the announcements of a deal for a loss and damage fund, which was the big victory out of this year's conference. I'm Cristian Salazar. I'm the climate editor for OptOut News, a network of over 170 news organizations that are independently financed. And with me today is Amanda Magnani, a Brazilian journalist who's been tracking the developments at the COP27 conference.
Hi, Cristian. Thank you so much for having me. It's a big pleasure to be able to collaborate with you and with OptOut in this chat about COP27.
Yeah, so going into this conference, there wasn't a lot of high expectations because there was a feeling that the wealthy nations might not want to really commit to any major policies in order to fight the climate crisis, but things turned out a bit differently. Do you want to give us a sense of the conference overall?
Yeah, sure, of course. I think that mostly for global south countries, which are the countries that are being most drastically affected by climate change, the biggest expectation was to have this discussion for loss and damage, because this is not a new discussion and this is not a new request and demand from these countries. But I think that especially in the last couple of years, particularly since the pandemic, it has become even more clear that this is a now or never kind of situation. And especially after COP26, which was a little bit of a letdown with all the, over careful wording regarding fossil fuel and the phasing out, and not a lot of promises, and especially not a lot of details about how to actually implement these promises. There was a huge expectations from these countries that like COP27 would be the African COP and the loss and damage COP. But as you mentioned, it wasn't up until the very last minute that this actually entered the agenda, right? In fact, if I'm not mistaken, it was in an extended time from the discussion, from the pre-COP discussion, that it entered in the agenda, which per se was already a win. Like it already counted as a win, because before that it had never been a topic whatsoever for wealthy countries who have always avoided it. So this last minute inclusion of loss and damage was already a win, but of course not as much as a win as the actual creation of the loss and damage fund. It was I can't remember exactly who said this. I think it was the Barbados minister. We can check that, but who said that compensation that is delayed is actually no compensation at all. So that's something that had to be done this year. And yeah, even though like the wealthy countries did tiptoe a lot around the topic and avoided it throughout most of the event, also last minute, the same way that it was a last minute inclusion, it was also a last minute decision to create this fund, which is a win, but of course with some buts in the way.
Right. Now I want to dig into this a little more. I mean, so the climate fund, the loss and damage fund that's being created, it's been 30 years that people have been calling for something like this, right? And a lot of people call this climate reparations, but I think they were very careful in saying that this was not really climate reparations. I don't, it's interesting because they put out this plan for this loss and damage fund, but there's no actual, mechanism for funding it. There's no way forward for operationalizing it. So that's going to be work that people are going to have to do in the future, in the next COP maybe, or down the line over the next few years, right?
Yeah, of course. I think that Yeah, as you said, there's not a lot of details. Again, like happened last COP, there are not a lot of details on how they're going to do it. And as you said, countries are not willing, wealthy countries are not willing to say that this is reparations. Because when you acknowledge this fund as a reparation for countries, you have to admit guilt. And even though countries do kind of, well, I mean, they know they are responsible for climate change and they are much more responsible than the countries that are suffering from the consequences. Acknowledging it as reparation is a way of acknowledging guilt. And of course, once you acknowledge guilt in this topic, you will also be forced to acknowledge all the guilt regarding colonization and the colonial way in which global warming and climate change takes place. So yeah, of course, they were very, very careful with that. And I also have a bit of a feeling that this is in a sense a major win, in the sense that countries accepted creating this fund, even though they were not really willing to do it. And I think that the position of the US made it really clear when John Kerry, who was the special climate envoy from the US to the conference, said with all the words that in no way whatsoever would this fund happen. So in a sense, of course, it is a win that it was created, but there is a lot more to go in order for this to become a thing, especially because in the way it was debated and the way it was produced and concluded, there was no talk, for example, about the phasing out of fossil fuel. And the way it's done, you know, like just saying, okay, we're creating a fund, good, but no, not much talk about how long it will take, how much money. Wealthy countries had already been promising since 2009, which was COP15. They had already been promising to spend, I think, $100 million a year for poor countries.
I think it was actually 100 billion, right? I think it was 100 billion.
Sorry, yeah, 100 billion.
Yeah.
100 million is nothing, 100 billion.
No, it's nothing these days.
And that they should have started this in 2020. So it's been 2 years and it still hasn't happened. So of course, not putting a deadline into when this is actually going to happen and how much it's going to be and how this money is going to be given. At least one thing is that it's not going to be seen as a loan of sorts, not like the countries would have to pay back, which is already a step forward. But also one thing that I've seen a lot of the response from global South countries about concern regarding this lack of fossil fuel phasing out. Because if you focus much on paying for loss and damage without looking at the root cause of the problem, it's not going to change much, because you will be paying for countries to, you know, like try to rebuild and also try to adapt prior to these damage occur. But if you keep, you know, like drilling and burning and, you know, and the such, the issue will still not be solved.
Right.
So yeah, I think that there is still a lot to go regarding how this fund is actually going to work and how effective it's actually going to be, especially because just like please correct me if I'm mistaken, but just like the Paris Agreement, it's not binding. So the countries agreed to do that, but there are no sanctions or no way to force them into following these treaties and these agreements that they signed up for.
Yeah, that's how these agreements work, right? And then somebody like Trump comes into office and can pull us out of an agreement like the Paris Agreement, and then Biden comes back. It was interesting, you know, Biden ended up at the conference, but the response was pretty lukewarm. I mean, and I think his message was pretty mild. I think he, you know, announced some, you know, methane emissions effort to cut methane emissions, but I think everybody was looking for leadership from the U.S. on loss and damage, and it really is interesting that it took, you know, a lot of global South countries, along with the European Union, intervening at the last minute to really get that loss and damage fund created. So, but the U.S. and China as well seem to be standing in the way right, of this of creating this fund, which even Pakistan's I think climate minister was cheering the creation of the fund because after those devastating floods in their country, I mean, that was like a wake-up call, I think, for a lot of people that this really has to happen.
And I think that two things that you mentioned that I think are worthy of commenting. One is that, especially after that law that the US passed earlier this year, that was supposed to be this very big law with a lot of funding for, like fossil fuel phasing out in the
Inflation
US.
Reduction Act.
Yeah, exactly. So like you expected more of the US and of Biden also being a liberal, which of course was not delivered. But also I think that regarding China, there is a very big issue, which is that China still wants to be considered as a global south / poor country, even though it's now one of the biggest economies in the world and one of the biggest polluters in the world. It's still like this geopolitical position of China, I think, is very complex, and really becomes an obstacle in like in dealing with climate change.
So good on the one hand, we have the fund, but bad on the other hand that there's no phase out of all fossil fuels, no reduction in emissions. I think the UN Secretary General even commented about this, was saying, the fund was a great a win, victory for the global South, but that the next COP will have to deal with what we do about emissions, right?
What's the next COP, right?
Yeah, the next COP. Yeah, just kick this down the line a little bit more, But I also want to talk, since you're in Brazil, I want to talk to you about, Lula made a huge appearance. A lot of exciting. He was like cheered as a hero, after he was became president-elect, and defeated Bolsonaro. And what was the sense in Brazil when Lula showed up in Egypt for this conference?
Well, I did write a piece for Al Jazeera exactly looking into this. I think that like in Brazil, of course, the feeling is still a bit mixed, because you may know that this was one of the most polarized elections in Brazilian history. Like the difference between the number of votes for Bolsonaro and Lula was very, very small. So of course there is still a lot of denialism in the country. But I think that in the international community, this was seen as a relief, and also like this new wind of hope worldwide. I think it's very important to understand what it means, and not just Lula being elected, but I think even more importantly that Bolsonaro was not re-elected, because under Bolsonaro we reached high, like the highest records in deforestation, in greenhouse gas emissions, and also like the invasions in indigenous lands tripled. So he really was horrible for the environment. And it's important to understand like this place that Brazil has. And one very important thing we have is the biggest part of the Amazon forest. And that matters a lot, because if the deforestation of the Amazon reaches 25% of the original coverage area of the Amazon, there's no hope for stopping global warming. Because at this point, which is called by scientists the point of no return, the Amazon will start to produce more greenhouse gases than it can absorb. So Lula being elected means that there is going to be a renewed effort to reduce deforestation and to keep protecting the Amazon. This is very important because he was already president twice in the early 2000s. So he was president for 8 years in a row. And during these 8 years, he managed to reduce in over 60% the deforestation levels in the Amazon. And then after his follower Dilma Rousseff entered, also from the same party, there was still a reduction, but not as intense as under Lula. So the fact that he's back means that, like environmentally speaking, that he will look into the Amazon issue and he is willing to tackle the criminal activities happening there. But one thing that is very important is that he's willing to restart multilateralism, which completely ended under Bolsonaro with, like actions such as fighting with France president, calling his wife ugly. So that's the level of external policies we had. So,
that's ridiculous.
yeah, exactly. So that's the level of ridiculousness we were experiencing. So having Lula back really does bring a lot of hope back in this sense. Also, two very important things that he said in his speech during COP27 was one, he mentioned the importance of tackling poverty and hunger and how they cannot be dissociated from the fight against global warming. And that's very important, especially for global south countries, because that's the thing, like you cannot really think about the future in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years if you don't have anything to eat now. Like people have priorities, and even, of course, even the people who are suffering with the consequences of climate change, they still have to feed themselves. And so very often they will still choose the worst scenario if it's better immediately. So this understanding that Lula brought, I think it was very important. Another thing is that he told, like the wealthy countries that they could expect him to be the debt collector of all these promises that are being made. But of course, this is all very nice, this is all very good, but it's not going to be easy, because the destruction that Bolsonaro caused to the country and to the country's finances was ridiculous. He's leaving a whole of, I don't know, like how many billions of reais. And so it's going to be very hard, because also like the situation that the country finds itself today is not the same as 20 years ago when Lula was first president. So like the criminal levels in the Amazon have skyrocketed. Like the region, if the Amazon region was a country, it would be the fourth in number of murders in the world. So it's a very
Wow.
Yeah, like violence, while in other parts of the country intentional killings have phased down, in the Amazon they have just kept growing. So it's really not going to be easy, especially because right now, knowing that Lula is coming, criminal activities have skyrocketed over the past month or so, because they know they're not going to be able to do the same thing once Lula starts in power, once he takes office. So all of this is going to be very challenging, like in dealing with the situation. Not to mention, of course, that we're dealing with a geopolitical context that is very different from 20 years ago. So, we have the war in Ukraine, we have the China-US relations, we have, like all the impact of Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also in Central Asia, the relationship with Belarus and the tensions between NATO and Russia. So all of this is going to be very hard. And of course, it also means that when the diplomatic context is not so easy, then diplomatic negotiations are also not so easy to do. So this is also going to be very challenging.
Well, I think a lot of people are really glad to see Lula back. I mean, especially people who care about the Amazon and know the connection between the Amazon and climate change and how important it is. Just to pivot a little bit, I mean, I think we probably should talk about where this was held. This was held in Egypt, Sharm el-Sheikh, under the control of an authoritarian government. As you reported in a series of videos for us, thank you so much. One of the big things is that they invited a PR company for fossil fuel companies to manage their, their profile, public profile for the conference, and also hundreds of lobbyists from fossil fuel companies came to the conference to make sure that they could influence the outcome. So what was do you see any kind of like concrete, like direct impact of all this corporate influence and the negotiations, or has it just been a lot of noise? So.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think that one very important thing is that I think the combination of where it took place, so Sharm el-Sheikh, which is this resort place, it was super expensive. There was at the same time that, you know, like all these fossil fuel lobbyists were invited, and there was a lot of this PR situation, this unethical PR situations, because it's not only that it's the same PR as big oil and Coca-Cola, but I read a lot about how they even used fake climate activists while actual climate activists are in jail and are being tortured and all of this. I think that all of this combined made sure that that the civil society was not present. And I think that one thing that has always marked COPs were the side events, because it was every year besides this year, it was not only about the negotiations taking place, but about all the other demonstrations that were happening at the same time. We had, like last year, we had Greta, you know, like we had the Fridays for Future. We had a lot of demonstrations of mothers from all around the world. You know, like you always had such a big presence and a big impact from civil society and climate activists who were there exactly to make pressure and to make noise and to really influence the decisions that were being made inside the event. And that's something we didn't see this year. And so I do believe that this absence of the civil society there made a huge impact. For example, in not having the phasing out of fossil fuel being mentioned in the loss and damage fund, or you know, like, or even in how long it took for the loss and damage fund to be you know, like for its creation to be decided. Also in, you know, like how vague it was. So I think, of course, all of that, when you have the interest of big oil and of fossil fuel lobbyists represented, but not the interest of civil society, then yeah, of course, this has an impact. You know, also we have to remember that you know, people inside were being persecuted, that there were a lot of websites that were blocked, you know, including like Human Rights Watch. So, you know, like people inside did not have access to human rights related content and to independent news. So yeah, I definitely think that this has an impact. But also, like, sorry, yeah, just another thing I remember that I think is still important when I was researching to produce this content for OptOut. I read a lot from Egyptians, from climate activists from Egypt themselves, who were against a boycott of the COP being there, because they did think it was important to have it there in Egypt to draw attention to the situation that is taking place in the country, both the humanitarian situation and the climate situation. So I think that this is also important to mention, that, you know, like Egyptian climate activists themselves still prefer that it happened there in spite of how it took place.
Interesting. It's so interesting. Well, we appreciate your help with this coverage this year, COP27. It's been fascinating to watch and to see what came out of it. We'll, of course, be tracking this, and our independent news partners will be tracking it as well. Publications like Grist and Currently and others. And so want to just wrap this up. Thank you very much. And we'll, I guess, you know, if you want to get the latest on climate news, you should subscribe to our newsletter. And thanks for watching.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me both in this coverage and in this chat. It was a pleasure working with you and with OptOut.